morning everyone, we are group 1. We are looking at embodiment through the looking glass of grammaticalization. Here are our group members on this slide. We were posed 2 questions at the beginning of the workshop. How are the universal grammatical categories embodied? And secondly, is embodiment itself universal? And in the mock session, sort of through discussion, at least among our group members, and at least the languages that we spoke within the group, we were able to establish that there is surely some sort of pattern in the processes that we use for embodiment. And so we primarily use 2 grammatical categories, and I'm going to start by redefining them just so that, because I'm going to keep using those words again and again. So we used the category of aspect, which is basically nothing but the internal temporal situation of the event. So whether an event has just begun, whether it's still in progress, continuing, or whether it has completed. So that is your aspect. And we took relative clauses. So basically relative clause markers are words like that and which and so on, which we use when we join 2 clauses. So when we say the book which I'm reading or the questions that you ask me. So those 2 kind of words are relative clause markers. So now I'm going to start by defining 2 other terms that primarily will take us through the process of grammaticalization. So what we're going to show today is how the process of grammaticalization takes place, and also how in turn embodiment takes place through these grammatical categories. So we have 2 basic notions, lexical categories and grammatical categories, which are, I'm going to technically call them as functional categories. So what are lexical categories? They are basically the words that provide the basic semantic content of the sentence. So to give you a concrete example, if let's take a sentence like I don't know, Rajesh ने marker से board पे लिखा, right? So what are the primary ingredients that kind of give you the semantic meaning of the proposition? So there is an animate human being, Rajesh, and there's a marker, and there's the board, and there's the activity of likhna, right? That is what will tell you the primary meaning of the sentence. These are what we call as lexical words. While all the rest of it, the ne, se, pe, and the sort of the past participle for the verb is what will give you the functional categories, which basically explain the relationship between all these lexical items, right? So, and this will actually help you to not sort of misrepresent a sentence like Markar ne Rajesh se board pe likha or something like that, right? Which, so it will kind of tell you the exact position and the relationship between all these grammatical categories. So next we move on to the fact that, so a lot of research, and especially in the area of child language acquisition, actually shows that these functional categories are in fact universal across all languages. And so if you take so children who if you take this similar sentence and if you role play it, and if you, for whatever reason, if you could role play the misrepresented sentence, the child would actually know that there's something wrong with the sentence, right? So, and this, the child knows with very, very little stimulus, very few instances of utterances. So, there is something innate in the child, and it sort of is shown universally across all languages. So, the functional categories are universal. The only difference is in the manifestation of across different languages. So, example, a category like aspect will either be in the form of verb inflections, like we see in English, where we have the main verb plus ing configuration, or we will have separate words for that will show aspectual markers. So in Hindi you will have kar raha hai, so there's the verb and then there is the temporal situation of the event. So this will vary across languages, but the functional categories are essentially universal. And so the observation is that a large number of these grammatical categories start off as being lexical, part of lexical categories before they actually become fully grammaticalized. So we will see throughout when we show you the process how a lot of the functional categories start off as lexical categories and then move on to becoming function words. So grammaticalization can be understood as a process in which lexical words start gradually shedding off its primary semantic content as it slowly inches its way towards grammaticalization. Of course, I forgot to mention that lexical categories are in fact an open class of words. So you can keep adding new terms to, the moment there is a new invention, like for example a computer, there will be so many new words related to that object. You need to label those objects. So it's an open class. So you have computer, you have a noun like email, which can also be used as verb, like I will email you and so on. So nouns, verbs, adverbs and adjectives are primarily lexical categories, and in fact I have an excellent example of a word that actually functions as all four, but due to the lack of time I will not mention that word, but it's a four-letter word, you can keep guessing what it is. And functional categories on the other hand are sort of closed categories, so you can never really add a new tense marker or an aspectual marker there. So I was saying that gradually these lexical words kind of move towards grammaticality over a period of time before it starts fulfilling a more grammatical function. And there is a climb in the process where you have a word which starts off as a lexical item, and there are instances where the verb, for example, will play the role of an aspectual marker and still function as a verb till it actually reaches grammaticality. So there is no, and it takes like roughly 10,000 years for sort of the life cycle of a word. So at every stage there is an increase in the degree of delexicalization till it actually reaches grammaticality. So next we have the stages of grammaticalization, and this is like a schematic representation of what's going to take place, and we will kind of get in detail to the exact stages of the life cycle of a word. So the first stage in the life of a word is semantic bleaching. So what happens here is something that I mentioned earlier, that slowly the word starts losing its semantic content and plays the role of a more grammatical function. So it loses most of its meaning. So now there are two kinds of semantic bleaching. There is the total bleaching, which, for example, the Marathi verb hone, which is now playing purely the role of an aspectual marker, is now it came from the Sanskrit word bhavati, which means to become. Right? So there is an obvious sort of change in the meaning of the verb. And then there is partial semantic bleaching, where you have all these compound verbs, like say in Marathi when we give or in Hindi for example when we give the word dalna. So dalna is still used as the primary meaning, but there you can still say mar dala and kar dala and khar dala and so on. So you see this sort of two roles that this word is playing. The next one is morphological reduction. What this means is that if you take the lexical item that, right? The lexical item that is a pronoun. So you have that book and those books. So there is this number distinction between singular and plural. But the moment this becomes a relative clause marker, you will say a sentence like the question that you asked me, but you will never say the questions those you asked me, right? It will still remain the questions that you asked me. So there is this loss of the number distinction when it becomes a relative clause marker, which is basically when it becomes grammaticalized. The next one is phonetic reduction or erosion. So when something is undergoing grammaticalization, it loses, or it starts sort of stripping off some of its phonetic substance. So in example in Gujarati, we say karu chu, which means I am doing, and that kind of becomes karuch, it becomes a single word. Right? And of course in English you have these sort of stripping down of things happening when you say kinda and let's and so on. So that's phonetic reduction. And the final one is obligatoryfication, which is actually nothing but a cacophony of 8 syllables. What basically happens here is that when grammatical categories get enriched enough to be expressed in a language, it becomes morphologically. When the language becomes rich in sort of that particular grammatical category, it starts expressing it morphologically. So that is what this thing is all about. And this process is seen in certain languages, but we have to kind of read the history of all languages to be able to tell you that something was not there in a language and now finally it is there. So that may not have been possible in a span of 2 weeks. And finally is the process of embodiment. And if you notice, we've taken embodiment to be sort of the next step, of the stage in the life cycle of the word. So here, the lexicon, the lexeme in question becomes capable of being used to describe abstract entities in the form of physical constructs, because it still retains some of its original primary semantic properties, and because there is a perceived similarity. So there are all these examples in, you could read out the Tamil examples.
So for example, in Tamil, it said, Naan Ippa Ulu Karai Solapure, so which could be literally translated as, I now one story tell go. Or in Odia, we have Se Amu Bharara Matha, which means he or she is the head of a family. And Hindi we say, Bina Sarkar ke baat mat karo, or don't say baseless things.
Right, so I don't think I need to explain where the embodiment is sort of taking place. We've kind of dealt with that. How much time do I have?
8 minutes.
Okay. So if time permits, I'm going to actually kind of get back to the body and give our profound thoughts on how we discovered that the body is so central to our understanding of the world and ourselves. But we can come back to that later. And in some sense, the language that we speak, the activity of language itself, language use especially to as concrete utterances, in itself is a kind of primary sort of embodiment, right? Where the moment you start using the language system, you are embodying it in some sense. So we like to call that a form of primary embodiment, and then kind of the rest follows after that. So of course, why does this happen? Right? So why is it that this whole shedding of lexical items happen, and what is the motivation, right? So now the first one is economy and ease of articulation. So you can have you can imagine two scenarios where you can say that we will have one word to represent every new concept that happens, right? So instead of using combinations of words which show some sort of iconicity, you would say that no, let's sort of keep one word that means only one thing. So no polysemy, no ambiguity, it solves all our problems. So, or you can do this combinatory thing where if you see some sort of perceived similarity, you try and incorporate the same lexical items in different combinations. And this is something that we do even in the number system, right? We have certain lexical items and you use them in various combinations to count until infinity, right? We could have had a separate name of some number for every item that we represent, but we don't do that. So that is the econometric principle. The second one is the language evolution theory, where it is said that languages sort of evolve from, say, having this feature of, say, one word per one idea, and then gradually, so they are called isolating languages, and then it moves on to agglutinative stage where you kind of combine 2-3 words and form sentences, and then you move on to synthetic or inflectional languages, which is the kind of languages that we speak, where the inflections themselves do most of the work of the grammatical category. So that is this stage of gradually how languages develop. But of course, it's not that our languages are more superior than sort of isolating languages. It's just that as a process of economy, we do these things, and of course there is this tug and pull that keeps happening. So if a language is morphologically rich in some area, that does not mean that it's the best language. It will have some other gaps and some other domains. And now we move on to reasons for embodiment. Right? So we said that this is how grammaticalization happens, and the next stage, if we take embodiment, these are the two causes that we think, one cause actually that we think why embodiment is. Sorry?
5 minutes.
Yeah. So why does this embodiment happen? So I think we think that the primary cause of embodiment is what is known as iconicity, right? Which is that you see it's based on resemblance, right? So you see some sort of similarity between the two concepts that you're trying to juxtapose metaphorically, which is why you use these concepts, and there is no real communication gap, right? When you say the head of the family, you can understand it in almost every sort of cultural context, right? When you say the head of the family, nobody will really think that your pet would be a head of the family. So it's sort of understood. So there are two kinds of iconicity. One is the imagic iconicity, which is what we are going on talking about, embodiment, where you see sort of compound verbs and so on, that when you have the action of sort of suppose grasping, you know that you can, when you say that you have assimilated the truth within you, or the concept within you, you can actually say that I grasp the truth without finding it difficult to communicate, right? So that is your imagic iconicity, and the other is phonetic iconicity, which I found really cool because very little work is being done on it, but I was terribly fascinated with it. So you have, suppose you take the demonstrative pronoun this and that, right? Now if you see that, so these two things will show proximity and distance from your body, right? So the vowels that are used in the terms this and that, if you see the vowel in this, it's kind of closer to your mouth than the vowel in that, right? You say ah, right? So it's further back from your mouth. So that is one sort of sound symbolism that happens there. So it is also observed in sort of languages, some Bhojpuri dialects where E and U mean this and that. Again, you see E as sort of closer to the mouth and U way back in the mouth, right? So that is phonetic iconicity. So that is primarily what we feel is responsible for embodiment. So to conclude, we'd like to say that grammatical categories are indeed universal, there's no doubt about that. And as far as embodiment is concerned, there are indeed patterns that are seen in languages. And of course, it is still a matter of empirical research. This is what we have been able to prove just from the languages that we have spoken among us. But it is a matter of empirical research, but it surely seems very, very promising line of research. So, to come back to whatever I have to say about the body, if I have a minute or so, we did realize that the body is extremely central to our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. And in fact, an excellent study could be the cultural sort of examination of how we use the body in expressing ourselves. So if you notice, taboo words will never be expressed in a form of body parts, right? So even the body parts that we cannot, the names of body parts that we cannot actually utter in sort of day-to-day conversation are not really used, you know. So when you say I'm in front of the house, you will never really say that I'm at the breast of the house or something like that. So it could be an excellent sort of study to show how you represent things through the body. And of course, another thing that I thought of was that even the way we name our sort of younger generation could be as a result of the kind of physical manifestation of, things that feel, are physically appealing. There are of course historical accidents, but there are very rare cases where you will have a negative physical experience used to name a child. So I think that could be an excellent sort of way to take this study forward. Thank you.
Very interesting. Questions?
No, thank you.
So, I actually have a couple of suggestions. First of all, I think, so one thing which I think what you noticed about the phonetic embodiment, so to speak, the position in the mouth basically, also suggests that the iconicity and the phonetic embodiment are not actually that different. Meaning, the iconic embodiment is essentially using vision
Sure.
as a map of the world, as a body map of the world, while the phoneticity is using an auditory production, a motor auditory production, right? So which suggests that actually, even if you look at, say, a Chomskyan ideas of minimalism and so on, where your PF and LF as the two boundaries of the syntactic language acquisition device, even those can actually be turned into bodily interfaces, right? And so what that suggests is perhaps the generative and the embodied approaches are not utterly incompatible.
Sure, which is why we call it the primary embodiment, where you have the system and to actually be able to use that system would be.
Right? So what therefore it suggests is that the body coordinatizes the world in the different sensory motor facilities in different ways. Right? So the way vision does it is not the way that audition does it, and it's not the way that touch and others. So each one of those gives you different ways of representing the world, which in turn come into language through their own different instruments. And I think that that's definitely what it is.
I noticed that when you speak about embodiment, you mostly seem to be emphasizing on references to bodily parts, and you're not speaking so much about bodily experience, which is an important part of embodied cognition.
Yeah, sure. I agree that it was predominantly on body parts, but I also, so when I talk about sort of compound verbs and aspectual verbs, and in fact even naming rituals, I was essentially referring to physical experiences also.
Because then you also enter the problem of having to need much more explanatoriness.
Sure.
Because when you look at either image-based iconicity or you look at semblance, you can't explain things like saying she's an ice cream or she's hot or something like that, which are based on bodily experience and not bodily external features.
Could you explain?
Maybe my linguistics professor is not allowed to ask me questions.
Could you explain the difference of embodiment in lexical categories and embodiment in functional categories?
Right, so what I essentially spoke about, where I spoke about, say, aspectual markers that show forms of embodiment would be instances of functional categories, and also, and when he spoke about, the person being an ice cream or being hot would probably be instances of lexical embodiment.
But then how would embodiment be a stage in language development? Because then embodiment becomes a principle of explanation rather than a stage of language.
That's true, but I'm basing it on the fact that because lexical categories go on to become functional categories, and that again is based on the principle of iconicity, where and then because they are functional categories, they can be used with a variety of verbs where it increases its sort of domain of usage, which is why they go on to become embodied items. So there is surely this sort of climb where in the life cycle of the word, where it starts off as a label of one thing, but because of the perceived similarity, it kind of keeps progressing towards versatility in that sense.
Yeah, so rather than being a stage, you can actually see how the embodiment principle explains shifts in grammatically, rather than using it as a stage of form.
Sure.
I think that's the thing to do. In fact, to show how the same principle explains different stages of the word cycle. Right? But in particular, I would, going back to what Naresh was saying, I think that if you look at the lexical versus the functional categories, I think my instinct and my hypothesis would be that experiential sources of embodiment will be more expressed in lexical categories, and the body parts and other sort of structural features would be more in the functional categories for obvious reasons. Right? So I think that that's something that's right.
I was struck by this and that, and haven't given type of association between the vowels and the distances and so on. But I will be sure that this is not, this seems to be across language families. That's
Sure,
what
sure.
they're saying, right?
It is a speculation. That's why very little work has been done on it. But I was sort of desperate to mention it because I found it a very sort of cute thing to study.
It is cute.
So, yeah, it is.
It's very striking, in fact.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is true that it is not sort of an empirical universal phenomenon, but it could be one way of kind of justifying sort of embodiment.
What seems to be explainable, either way it is explainable. Either that came first and this came later, or once that has come into the language, in different languages, that it is in fact taken an embodiment aspect in terms of descriptive explanation.
And in fact, if you actually notice, if you go into a foreign sort of language domain, and if you actually want to express sort of this and that, you will automatically, if I'm not mistaken, use these sort of constructs. Probably because they exist in your language, but I'm quite convinced that we would do such a thing.
I mean, it's just an affordance that lends itself obviously to this. Any other questions? We have maybe time for one last one. Yes.
Do you think co-verbal gestures during language acquisition are a good cue to embodiment?
Sure, absolutely. So it's just another way of probably explaining or communicating, right? But we will still use our physical proximity and distance and experiences and facial expressions to express those experiences. They're definitely, there's no doubt about it. It's just that verbal expressions are verbalizing those physical experiences, where here you have a sort of different means to communicate.
Excellent. And one last question. Where in its life cycle is the word Palavriya?
We could ask Tamil experts for that. But I found sort of this similarity, immediate similarity between killing, wanting to kill yourself and kind of stripping away the basic essence of a word and kind of transforming it into. So you could look at it as a transformation into another life.
What would be nice is when it's written out and seen. There is a